Well, hello and welcome to the All Saints podcast. I'm here with my friend Tyler Bauer in a rather fancy new studio. Big thanks to all the people who have contributed to making this happen. If you are watching on YouTube, you'll see the rather nice background behind me, and if you're listening, hopefully you'll find the audio better than it has been before. And I will say a little bit more at some other point about specifically naming the people who have contributed and worked so hard to make this little step forward a reality. But it is wonderful to share this space with my friend Tyler Bauer. Tyler, introduce yourself to our congregation at All Saints.
Yeah, happy to be here. And again, very beautiful background. We were talking about that before we got rolling. I'm Tyler Bauer. I've been, connected here for teaching at the Oaks. I do a number of things. I'm a professor at Texas Baptist College. I also teach online at Palm Beach Atlantic University, so I've been doing that for a couple of years now. And finishing up a doctorate in philosophy at Southwestern, so that's some of my connections there. And then teaching at the Oaks here, located at All Saints, since it opened. So I've been part of that crew for a long time. So yeah,
and that's how we met. I mean, we've both been teaching at the Oaks. I've been teaching Bible and theology for initially 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th and 12th graders. More recently, passing the baton to Pastor Shaw for the 7th and 8th graders. Yeah. Tell us what you teach and the kind of things that you've been reading and studying with young people.
Yeah. So at the Oaks, we call it Traditio. In the tradition, it's really sort of catch-all sort of humanities course, so you could call it that, I suppose. It's everything from we study history, we go through historical texts, we do philosophy, we do literature. So there's a bunch that we're going through. So things range from survey of American history to reading the Summa of the Summa, Thomas Aquinas. We've read Nietzsche, we've read Emma by Jane Austen. So a whole wide variety of things.
Mm-hmm. And before we get into what I really want to talk about for the benefit of people at All Saints, we ought to talk about what you're going to do next for the benefit of anybody in Florida who might be listening, because you're not hanging around here much longer. Tell us what you're moving on to.
Yeah, unfortunately leaving the Oaks, but for a good reason. So it's important to know first, I'm a native Floridian, so I'm not abandoning Texas for Florida. I feel like that might be important to know. I'm returning home.
Although it's one of the only states that you'd want to move from Texas to.
Probably, right? Yeah. A good conservative state. And happens to be my favorite one. So I recently received an offer to come be the headmaster at one of the campuses of Pietas Classical Christian School, which has an affiliation with the Davenant Institute. One of the president of Pietas has been working with them for a while and started a classical school there. I needed some help, and so he's got a couple of campuses and asked me to come help run one of them. And then at the same time, this same group, along with a couple of other guys, has decided to launch a classical liberal arts college in Florida called Christ College, which will begin offering degrees in 2025. So I'll be there as a professor of humanities, probably the chaplain. That's being discussed still.
So just a few things.
Yeah, just a few things, yeah. And I'm going to make maybe a cheeky comment in that we're somewhat competing with New St. Andrews for some similar curriculum structure.
You're quite a long way away from New St. Andrews. So
yeah. And we're a whole lot closer to the beach.
Yeah, that's right. And, well, I remember hearing... I can't remember whether it was Roy Atwood when he was president or Ben Merkel talking about how he would like, I think it was Ben Merkel, the current president, how they would like to see more institutions like this spring up. Yeah. And certainly it's one of those things that actually it leads into the kind of topic I'd like to broach with you more today, because if you were going to move away to northern Idaho to go to college, for some people, that might be 50 miles down the road. For some people, it might be 2,500 miles away or even further. And so it raises this question of the interaction between your educational choices and educational aspirations and other factors in your life. Yeah. And what I'd really like to get to today is to think through different models for education, not only tertiary education, in fact, not specifically that, but mostly for young people, for children. And you know the background here at All Saints, we've got well over 100 young people. I haven't even actually done the math. I mean, it must be 200 young people because we've got pushing 400 in the congregation. And so we got a lot of people in full-time education. And one of the questions that their parents are wanting to ask constantly is, what's the best thing I can do to educate my child? What's the best thing I can... Yeah. Education being a part of upbringing, everything is to be brought under the lordship of Christ. We've got to do the most Christ-honoring version of whatever it is that we decide to do educationally. Okay, so for us, given where we are, and that's different for every family, what's the best we can do? And one of the things I've noticed is that when it comes to educational paradigms, so classical Christian or some other version of Christian education, there's a whole texture of responses. Educational settings, home, small school, co-op, large school, and then the interaction of those choices with other aspects of upbringing, like parental discipline of children and character of children, and whether children have particular educational needs and so on and so forth. All these things playing together. So you can't give a one-size-fits-all answer. And yet at the same time, when people come and talk to me and they say, okay, so what should I do with my kids? I don't want to just say, well, you can't give a one-size-fits-all answer. So what I'd love to do in the next 3 or 4 hours or so, I jest only a little bit, is just to talk through with you how you see the different pros and cons, the different challenges of those different settings, curriculum choices, context for education, and how they interact pastorally with the challenges that parents face.
Yeah.
So maybe let's start with the broad paradigm question. So it's we have a growing tradition in conservative, reformed, evangelical churches in the US and further afield of what has come to be known as classical Christian education.
Yeah.
And that actually is not a particularly ancient term, but it claims to be rediscovering some ancient and venerable educational traditions. Yeah. So talk to us about your understanding of that particular model for education. That's more or less what the Oaks embraces.
Yeah.
Right? What is classical Christian education?
Yeah. And allow me to give a little bit more background on me so I can give you the full scope of how I think about this. Grew up in what you would probably call the standard Christian education. Mm-hmm. So it looks very much like the public school, but it's got Bible class, right, and sort of fundamentalist sort of principles. You know, don't read this, those are bad things. Read this. But we're going to teach you all the same stuff as public school, but we are going to give you some Bible class. So I grew up in that, and I'm very thankful for that education. But it is what it is. And then went to college. In my undergraduate degree, I got trained on how to teach in the public school, knowing that I didn't particularly want to do that, but that's how I got trained. Had to go and intern, so I spent some time teaching in the public school as a learner teacher, and then went and worked for almost a decade at, again, I don't know what to call it other than the sort of standard model Christian school. So Same sort of thing. Looks very similar to public school, has Bible classes, that kind of thing. And while doing all that, got into studying philosophy and apologetics and these sorts of things, and realized like, oh, there's a much deeper way of thinking about life and what have you. And so when we got here, I didn't know about the Oaks when we got here. But got plugged in with them and was like, oh, hey, there's people who actually like want to embrace some of these things that I've just been sort of thinking about and discovering. So that sort of a short version of the journey of how I got to this place. So to the question of thinking about what is classical education in the broadest terms, it's education sort of based on both the ancient Greek and Roman system and also the medieval Christian system, and sort of the synthesis of all those things, and it's sort of a renewal movement trying to reclaim some of those old ideas in a contemporary context.
Right, okay. So give us an example of how that would show itself, whether in the structure of the curriculum as a whole or in particular choices of courses within it.
Yeah. So a lot of contemporary education is solely focused on how to get a job. And so that's its sort of baseline. I can remember growing up, and the questions that students asked were, how am I going to use this in my job? And the responses teachers gave as to why we were learning what we were learning is that, you'll need this one day when you're in the job market. And so except for Bible class, which was sort of this set aside
sprinkling on top to make it holy. Right?
Yeah, you make it Christian by giving it a Bible class. But everything else, all of the justification for doing what we were doing was, this is so you can get a job. And of course, then you go to college and you pick a particular degree, and that degree is meant to give you one job.
Vocational training.
Yeah, a very specific kind of vocational training. Versus, now I've been reading through Basil the Great's letters to young men reading literature, I think is what it's sometimes translated to in English. And he's encouraging them like, hey, the reason why you read literature is not for now, it's for the life to come.
Right.
So you're going to die, and then at some point in his good plan, God's going to resurrect you, however that is going to work. And so you're reading literature now so that you can be the right kind of person then. And so as opposed to vocational training, the general paradigm in a classical model is going to be, how do we teach you for an eternal perspective rather than a vocational perspective? And so just the starting point of how to think about it is eternal versus, I guess, temporal might be a way of saying it.
Okay. So let me push back a couple of the
Please do.
chinks here, and because in a sense I know that there's a response to this. So first I want to just ask a question about the epistemological framework for it. So you said the goal is to draw on some of the historical heritage of Greek and Roman approaches to education, synthesized with medieval and therefore with some Christian themes. I found myself wondering about that back in the day when our kids were young, and some folks at All Saints will have heard me say this before. I got it from Jim Jordan. The idea that the overall paradigm for classical Christian education, grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, which maybe we should just flesh out in a second, actually reflects biblical patterns of maturation as well.
Yeah.
So, in other words, perhaps you could, I'd want to, before I push back on the other point, the vocational point, I want to say yes and amen to the Greek, Roman, medieval thing by saying actually it's parasitic on Christian teaching.
Yeah.
So tell me whether you think this is right, and if so, what you'd want to add to it. In biblical terms, the way that God matures his people corporately is through three phases of history, which you could roughly label priest, king, prophet. They correspond to the three ordained, anointed offices in Israel. They correspond to who the most significant figures were in successive stages of Israel's history and their relationship with God. There were priests way back in the early days, the days of Moses. Moses, though a prophet, was also a priest. In the priestly domain, everything is very simple, and you've just got to keep the rules. No creativity is involved in building the tabernacle. You build it exactly according to the pattern that's shown you on the mountain, and all the sacrifices are to be done exactly as the book of Leviticus says. The kingly era, which roughly corresponds with Israel's monarchy, introduces a new layer of complexity. So it builds on priestly traditions, but Solomon famously is presented with two women and one baby, and they both claim the baby belongs to them, and you search the book of Leviticus in vain to find the relevant Bible verse to tell you what to do. So Solomon needs to exercise wisdom in figuring out what to do in a complex situation. Now, what happens next is after a few generations, in fact, not many generations, the kings start to go sideways, and God raises up prophets in great numbers to fix or correct the problems of the kingship. And so priestly, follow the rules. Kings deal with complexity. Prophetic, fix this busted system and rebuild it when it goes wrong. And those three stages of Israel's history map onto individual development of people. This is an eschatological principle that individual eschatology tracks cosmic or corporate eschatology. Yeah. So what you see in Scripture pertaining to the people of Israel and the people of God more broadly is a pattern for young people growing up. So classical Christian education, with its grammar, logic, rhetoric, is actually an unconscious, perhaps, re-articulation of priest, king, prophet. With the grammar is you learn the rules. You're doing languages. You just learn lots of vocab and lots of declensions and conjugations. Logic, you're starting to put things together. You're starting to read texts that are a bit more complicated. Rhetoric, you're starting to write your own Latin poetry. Creatively engaging with the material. So if I wanted to make so here's me, I'm a pastor. If I want to make a case for classical Christian education, I'd make that case. And so tell me whether you agree with that, whether you think it fits with the recovery of historic Greek, Roman, medieval paradigm, or whether you want to supplement it with something else.
Yeah, no, I think that is good. In one sense, though, all those labels are artificial, and that like there's nowhere in the Bible that says, "Oh, by the way, when you train up your kids, don't forget the priest, king, and prophet stages." Mm-hmm. No more so than grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or primary, secondary, tertiary. All of these things are not. There's not a chapter and verse or something to find those, but I think that is right in thinking of it that way. There is this sort of natural progression to human learning. Mm-hmm. That you just can't escape it. Like, no matter what you're doing, you have the sort of, first you learn the absolute basics, and then you kind of fumble in thinking through how the pieces go together on your own, and then you're able to actually do it on your own. And so all of that tracks, and I think even mapping it onto Israel's history, I think we can just see some of those developments that happen. So I think that does make a lot of sense, and to think about it that way. And I think a good thing to remember too, sometimes people get queasy, hesitant when you start talking about the Greeks and the Romans, because those are pagans, right?
You're not kidding, right?
Yeah. So the reason why we pick up their paradigm, though, is not because there's something particularly special about Greeks and Romans, all these dead pagans. We pick up their paradigm because a lot of what they said was true. And so there's a reason why the medievals picked this up. And I think this is part of how we have to think about this as Christians. If somebody says something true, that means it's Christian.
Right.
We can't escape that. Like, if God is truth, and the pagan says a true thing, the pagan has said a Christian thing, whether or not they know it.
Right. See, this intrigues me because I'd not realized the school that you're moving to is associated with the Davenant Institute, which, of course, they're a bunch of Reformed guys who have a vision of natural law, which is, well, for some, and myself included, is like it's giving more scope to natural law than is theologically legitimate. But what's interesting in connection with this particular point, I don't think I'd want to disagree with the conclusion. So there's a way of getting to classical Christian education by saying, well, God has revealed himself in nature in such a way that we can read moral norms from the created order and from history. That's a natural law approach.
Yeah.
But there's a way of articulating what looks like a similar result in a completely different way, which is to say, all truth is God's truth. You start off as an absolute hardcore presuppositionalist, which I know some of the Davenant guys would not want to be. And then what you say is that, borrowing Van Til's language, historically what's happened is because people are living in God's creation, because you can't not be living somehow in line with the world that God made if you're going to live at all. The people who've succeeded in different domains have always unconsciously been building to some degree on Christian foundations.
Yeah.
So they might not acknowledge this, but people have observed, for example, the Christian foundations of modern science. Most modern scientists don't acknowledge this, but the reality is that it was the recovery of Christian assumptions about creation and about secular vocation and so on, which led to the scientific revolution. So back to the Greeks and the Romans and the medievals, they've let's imagine we think the worst for a second, and this is almost certainly too critical, but imagine we think the worst of all those Greeks and Romans. They're all pagans, they all hate God, and so on and so forth. But all the ones who didn't stumble upon patterns of education that reflect the created order, in the end failed. And because they're so long ago, you can see the failure because it's worked itself out in history. Whereas the ones that have succeeded were accidentally stumbling upon Christian truth in their educational paradigms. And so this is how, for me, the discovery felt like it actually happened, that we were doing classical Christian education because we read Dorothy Sayers' essay, Recovering on the Lost Tools of Learning, and we read Doug Wilson's book on relating to the same essay. And it was only later that it dawned on me, and I think it might have been Jim Jordan that prompted the thought, and then I read him in more detail, and then I wrote something about it. I think I might have written it without even referencing him, which is a mistake on my part. That gets called plagiarism sometimes. Anyway, it was. I can't remember where it went. Maybe it went journal somewhere. Anyway, somebody found it. For me, it was like discovering the Christian foundations of what previously I had treated as wrongly as sort of morally neutral educational wisdom. Turns out it's not morally neutral. It's borrowed capital of Christian theism, articulated probably better by some unbelievers than by many Christians. And so that picture. So if we're sitting down with a kind of pro-natural law Davenant guy, let's say, who you could be hanging out with.
Well, that's me too.
Like you, right?
Yeah.
I'd want to say, I don't need to buy into a high view of natural law in order to buy into the claim that historically what God does is to cause things to flourish in the creation to the degree that they reflect his character, which lies at the foundation of all created reality. So an educational system which cuts with the grain of how he's made us is going to work, and here is one, right?
Yeah. And, I agree with that. I mean, I'm a big pro-natural law guy. And the way that I would...
We've got to talk about that at some point. But
yeah. Well, just the short way that I would articulate that is... so I'm somewhat hesitant many a time to be too positive of like the precept view, mostly because of guys who wield it like a club, and not necessarily because of the view itself. But when I think about the natural law thing, some people would say this, and I think those guys would be wrong, but to think that like everyone is aware of all the right things because of the natural law, and I would disagree with that. I would just, my argument would be that the natural law is the way that the world works, and so people come to recognize it because it just is how the world works, or they can ignore it, and then the world punches back eventually because you're just doing it wrong.
But is that not better described as a created order that is inescapable rather than a natural law?
Well, yeah, and so in one sense, I'm happy with the term natural law just because that's the term that kind of gets used. But yeah, created order I think is also a proper way of saying it. I mean, the law. So when we say the law of nature, sometimes that gets modernist, sort of David Humean approaches. Like David Hume's thought of natural law is that this is the way the world is, and this is the way the world works, and you can't break any of that. Versus someone like Thomas Aquinas or Thomas Reed, they're like, no, that's the way that God built the world, and he does whatever he wants. And so even in something like natural law, you're going to have two different kinds of approaches to it. I think we tend to think in Humean language rather than Thomistic language about the natural law.
Right. So my objection to natural law, and I realize this is a parenthesis, so if you wanted to skip over the next 5 minutes, then go right ahead. But my objection to natural law is absolutely not an objection to created order or to God's design in creation, to the claim that God's ways work and other ways fail. I'm not objecting at all to the idea that you will, if you live long enough, or if you observe history for long enough, you'll be able to, with increasing clarity, see what sorts of things more likely than not reflect God's character than others, because some things work and other things don't. My objection is the idea that you can read those things infallibly. Right. So if people, where I get jumpy, no, more than jumpy, very jumpy, is the idea that it's possible to look at a culture or a human institution or ways in which people relate to each other, and say that and read simply off the surface a law in the sense of this is divine revelation which is binding upon us. Because I think I'm with Calvin when he says what we need. So sin has blinded us to the reality of God's revelation in creation. So we tend to distort it. And what we need is scriptural lenses through which to view the created order. So I'd want to see scripture as like the glasses that you put on that help you to start making sense of the world. And after a while, you get the hang of it. It's like, oh, I can see things now about how... And you realize you're seeing through scriptural lenses how things ought to be.
Yeah.
But in strict epistemological terms, the criterion on the grounds of which you judge a moral claim to be true is not that creation says it, because we still can't distinguish between those things which are distorted by our sinfulness and those things which are clarified.
Yeah.
So maybe we're in much more of the same place than...
I think we are. I think just coming from slightly different backgrounds, probably using terminology a little bit different. So very pro Thomas Reed, Presbyterian, common sense realist is the way he's thinking about the world. So, I mean, he's going to talk about, the natural law exists and we get to it fallibly.
Okay.
So, if I punch the wall, it's going to hurt. Putting glasses on will help me see that better.
Yes.
But it's not going to remove. The putting on the glasses doesn't make the wall there. Same thing with the natural law. I think this is where, and maybe to end the parentheses here, if you come at it metaphysically, it's more of a posterior observation. Like, oh yeah, of course. Like cultures don't go around murdering everybody because that's the way the world works. So it's kind of created order language too.
Yeah.
Versus if you come at it epistemologically, it's like, well, what can we know from the natural law and what have you? And it's like, well, you're starting with the wrong place. If you start metaphysically and you root its foundation somewhere, you're just looking and going, yeah, this is the way the world works, and so this is an explanation as to why people think some of the things that they do. So I think what I'm calling natural law, you're probably more comfortable calling created order, and I'm fine with that language too. Yeah. But yeah, I reject virtually anything that humans can do infallibly.
Right. It's interesting because we should end the parenthesis here and get back to education. But it strikes me as here is another example of a situation where if we do our analysis and if we engage in a discussion on the basis of two or more predetermined categories, do you believe in natural law or not? Right, we're going to make a mess of things because what actually happens is that minimally within those categories, there's nuance and distinction which needs to be observed. More likely, the boundaries of the categories are drawn too clumsily, too woodenly, and quite often you discover what I think we'd discover if we talked longer, which is these boxes are not like this, separate. They're kind of overlapping, and there's a bunch of claims in the overlap, which are the things we both affirm. And maybe there are some. We're coming at it from different. Like Nestorians and Monophysites always come at the same problems, worried about the opposite things, right? But in the end, you can make a bunch of joint affirmations which get you out of the mess.
Yeah.
Now, let's try and figure out how we can pretend this was all about education, right? The reason it's about education, just about where we were, is that there's a case for classical Christian education which seeks to adopt biblical priest, king, prophet.
Yeah.
We mustn't kid ourselves that that's actually how this movement in the last few decades has found its resurgence. It was actually through a desire to rediscover stuff from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the medieval period, which looked darn sight better than many things that have been read and written in the last century. And frankly, for the TikTok generation to be criticizing the literary output of ancient Rome is a little bit rich. Anyway, so moving on from that. So what that means is we are all heirs of these rediscoveries. Classical Christian education is going to try and shape the curriculum, so grammar, logic, rhetoric, and then the content is going to be seeking to privilege Latin, ancient history, a bunch of other things, which draw on that cultural heritage. We've got a whole bunch of people who, for all kinds of reasons, say, well, I want to educate my child, or we are educating our children. Classical Christian is not an approach I sort of resonate with. I've just found there's this Christian curriculum. So it's a science curriculum, and it's written by a Christian, and she's very, very good. She's got a PhD from a good university, and she teaches really well. There's this history textbook, which is, again, written by a Christian, so it doesn't sequester Christian history off in a different box. It's actually part of the same history we're all living in. Here's a math curriculum, which looks more or less the same as the non-Christian math curriculum, but hey, anyway, there's a bunch of things which we're assembling here, and look, we make no claim to be classical Christian. We claim simply to be Christian. How would you want to interpret the moves that people have made in that kind of domain? Because we've got to be honest, there's a lot more of that going on than there is classical Christian going on. So what's happening there? Is that good? Is that legitimate? Is it actually drawing unconsciously on the emphases of the classical tradition, or is there other stuff going on?
I think there's a lot going on. So I knew when I was growing up in a Christian school, it was not the public school. Having taught in this kind of environment, a lot of people engage in Christian education because it's not public education.
Right.
And so there's not even plenty of non-Christians. For schools that take non-Christian students, a lot of parents send their kids there because it's not the public school. So they just see the things going on in public education, and their thought is, well, this is better than whatever that is. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think
boys are boys and girls are girls, and all that kind of complicated biology.
Yeah, they don't have the crazy, the ever-evolving pride flag and those kinds of things. So they don't have those kinds of things, and so people will send their kids to these institutions because they're like, well, it's not those things. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of people, I think that's as far as it goes. I don't think there's much more of a thought.
And you think a lot of Christians like that as
well? A lot of Christians are like that. Yeah. So I don't want to send my kid to the public school. This is a Christian school.
Right.
And I think the second layer of it is that for them, there is nothing else.
Right.
Not that they don't have other options, which they may not, but setting that aside. I think for a lot of people thinking about it, there is education. And like you were talking about earlier, they sort of think of education as morally neutral. And so you've got public education, which is taking a neutral thing and sprinkling a progressive ideology over it. And then you've got Christian education, which is taking a morally neutral thing and sprinkling a conservative ideology over it. And that's that. And so I don't want the progressive ideology. I want a more conservative ideology. And so it's the Christian, it's education with Christian themes as opposed to education with progressive themes.
Right. So that's the way that a lot of people make the decision. It gets people out of progressive, harmful educational paradigms. Makes me think that's not a particularly stable framework for educating kids, right?
Yeah.
So a couple of thoughts just strike me. The first is, to the extent that there is or was anything good in this classical paradigm, in the broadest sense, just the kind of shape, grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, to the extent that that pattern has any wisdom in it, it will actually be found subconsciously elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the biblical pattern priest, king, prophet could have been rediscovered by the medievals without naming it, it could be rediscovered by people in 1980 writing online curriculum, writing Christian curricula, and in 2010 writing online curricula. The same thing could be rediscovered in the sense that people realize the way kids learn most effectively is by giving them nuts and bolts first and then encouraging them to put it together. You don't get a 4-year-old to write poetry. They can't write. You probably don't get a 10-year-old to write poetry.
That'd be bad.
It'd be bad poetry. You get them to read a ton of poetry, so by the time they're 16, they can write it.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things I want to say to parents, like at a pragmatic level, is you are going to have an implicit philosophy of education, and it may draw on elements of what we call classical Christian, because let's do away with the boxes, right?
Yeah.
And let's just think about the substance. It may have elements of what we call classical Christian education, insofar as it's just it reflects the development of a child. A child needs to learn the grammar of language and math and so on before they can put it together.
Yeah.
What is somebody missing out on if they stop there? Suppose somebody says, "Okay, I get it, Pastor Jeffrey. We've got a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, and we were doing what we thought was just Christian, and you've persuaded us that there's something substructural that resembles the classical Christian model. But we don't really want to take that any further. We're happy with what we've got." Are they missing out, or would that be a problem?
Yeah. So it's remarkable. I've gotten into this discussion a bunch of times. I talk about, people ask, what do I do now? And so I teach a classical Christian school. Everyone wants to know what that means. What does it mean that it's classical or something like that? And so the first question I always ask, because usually it's not usually hyper progressive folks that are asking these sorts of questions. It's usually Christians, relatively conservative Christians, who are just curious as to what this whole thing's about. And so I always ask them, "Are you conservative?" They just say, "Yeah, of course." I'm like, "Great. What are you conserving?" And they usually don't have an answer for that, because they know that conservative means not progressive, or conservative means Republican, or conservative means Christian, or something like that. Which all of those are kind of goofy ways of thinking about it. Anyway,
there's enough truth in them to do damage.
Yes,
but just about.
Yeah. So I was wondering, okay, so the thing that we're conserving is the Western Christian tradition and all the things that come along with it. Okay. And some of those things are good, some of those things are not good. There are things that, as Protestants, we go, we probably don't want X, Y, or Z, whatever it might be. But in general, we're saying like, hey, there's a whole lot of thinking that happened that we're wanting to tap into, and we're wanting to be part of that long line of deep Christian thought. And so usually like people are, oh, okay, now I'm listening. And then I ask the question, okay, so you're conservative. Are you Protestant?
Hmm.
Yes. Okay, great. How do you think that the Protestant reformers thought and were able to do a lot of what they did? Well, they were pulling on this tradition. And then, of course, I can always go, and of course, you're a conservative, so that means you like the American founding, right? And they always say yes. Like, okay, great. How do you think that they learned how to think? And so usually by those three stages, like, okay, you think yourself a conservative. What are we conserving? Do you think yourself as a Protestant? Sometimes even Roman Catholics, although they have less of a hard time making this jump.
Yeah, because they're going to have an easier time with we're conserving tradition thing,
yeah.
right?
Yep. And then American conservatives, pro-American founding and things like that. And it's like, okay, so just as there's a lot more to this answer, but just to kind of give somebody a really sort of easy ramp into it, it's like, look, all of these pieces that you say you really care about are all connected to this longer Christian way of thinking about the world. This long tradition of thought that's been building on itself. So if you want to be connected to that, if you really claim to be connected to that, there's this whole line of thought to be connected to.
Right.
And so why do we want to do that as opposed to what we're doing?
Mm-hmm.
What do we need the classic thing for? And so then I usually just have to point out, yeah, well, the thing, often modern education is just looped into progressive education,
right,
which came about 150 years ago at the most.
So let me try and make a case off the back of that then to Christian parents who feel, again, still a degree of unease with the category of classical, but they're willing to concede, all right, there's a biblical basis for the general framework, grammar, logic, rhetoric, priest, king, prophet, and there's something valuable in our historical traditions.
Yeah.
So then what we could do is we could ditch the label classical Christian education for the sake of people who just like, I'm not sure I want to buy into everything that's associated with that.
The word classical has some connotation to these old books. I mean, if you...
Which, incidentally, that's like Library of the World's Best Literature up there. And there's quite a lot of those in that library.
Well, so, I mean, think about it, though. So some of these books here, they're not... They feel old and inaccessible. And they feel dusty and not useful.
Right.
So the word classical can connote that, where it's like, well, that's old stuff. Like, it's not helpful. Yeah.
So then let's ditch the vocabulary of classical for the sake of trying to walk through this process pastorally with parents who are conscientious Christian parents who want to think, what's best for my kids? I want to say, okay, forget classical as a category, but we're okay with priest, king, prophet as a pedagogical framework, and we're okay with the idea of there's stuff in our past that we don't want to let go of. So what you're then doing is, when it comes to curriculum choices, like what books are we going to read, what events are we going to study in history, and so on and so forth, you're really building a curriculum in the broadest terms off the back of Chesterton's fence, say, or Roger Scruton's argument for conservatism. So Chesterton's fence was like, you come into this place and you look at these books and it's like, well, I can't think for the life of me why anybody would bother to own one of those. So let's throw it out. And Chesterton would say, no, if you can't figure out what it's doing here, you must keep it, because it might be doing something really important.
Yeah.
And
it's keeping the bull from running you over.
Right. Yeah. The bull that you can't see.
Yes.
And if you are a parent of a 6-year-old, you don't know what your 6-year-old is going to need when they're 25. But the last thing you're going to do is throw away Augustine's Confessions just because you never read it and you managed fine. You think you managed fine? Really? So maybe you should keep Augustine's Confessions and give it to your 6-year-old when he turns 10 instead of something written 10 years ago. So there's the Chesterton's fence argument, which is kind of... So Roger Scruton's point, as I remember it, that is the most elegant case for conservatism in general terms culturally is it's just easier to destroy things than to make them. And therefore, we should be very, very slow to destroy things. Because once it's gone, you're going to have a really hard time recapturing it.
Yeah.
Now, here's the problem. Where we are now, culturally, quite a lot has gone.
Yes.
So with our kids, we are in the process of trying to figure out where that fence was and rebuild it quick before the bull stampedes over the hill.
Yes.
Or what are those institutions and those modes of understanding the world, which used to be, even in our parents' or grandparents' generation, used to be so foundational? Could we find those and give them to our kids? And it turns out, yeah, you can. The wonders of modern technology, and,
Yes.
or just publishing, that's fairly modern technology. It's only 600 years old or something. Because of that, we're living in this era where we have this spectacular, unparalleled access to riches of literature, history, the sciences. I mean, you can get an MIT degree online without paying a cent beyond what it costs you for your internet access. I mean, it's unbelievable, the stuff you can get access to. And really what we're saying is, why would you try and rebuild from scratch? If we're reformed, and I want to say this specifically to people at All Saints, we are emphatically not me and my Bible on a desert island fundamentalists. We are reading the scriptures, and we're doing so in the company of many, many people who are now dead, who thought about and wrote about these words in ways that shed light on them that we're benefiting from. That's why we're a confessional church and a reformed church, not a fundamentalist church. And this isn't to bash our fundamentalist friends. I think it's a fair representation of how they'd want to represent themselves. So for exactly the same reason, we are standing on the theological shoulders of theological giants. Mm-hmm. We want to stand on the educational shoulders of educational giants. And if you think we know better how to write books about godliness for young men than Augustine, think again.
Yeah. I'm going to paraphrase a Chesterton quote in that tradition, conservatism, these kinds of things are the democracy of the dead.
Yeah.
And so it's a safeguard against the tyranny of those who just happen to be alive.
Yeah.
Like we think we know all this stuff, and it's like, well, no, a tradition, a conservative approach, an actual conservative sort of approach is like, hey, those dead people had some really important things to say.
Yeah, votes for the dead.
Yeah. And their opinions are worth heeding, because just because we happen to be alive doesn't mean we're in any better position to understand something than they did.
Right. So just let's draw those threads together, because if we can say what we've talked about so far, it's paradigms for education.
Yeah.
So Christian, and then classical versus other. And the other, I'm not trying to encourage the congregation at All Saints or anybody anywhere to drop their Christian education and to self-consciously adopt a moniker, classical, that they find distracting, uncomfortable, filled with baggage. It's a deeper point than that. I want to say the thing that makes what classical educators call classical education good is a concern that ought to animate Christians, however you describe your education. It's a respect for anthropology, grammar, logic, rhetoric, priest, king, prophet, and it's a respect for history and the wisdom of the ancients. Now, which ancients? I mean, maybe we have a brief segue onto this. I mean, like which things you read. This little library we've got here is a tiny fraction of what you could read, and it is probably more than most high schoolers read in their educational journey. So this doesn't settle the question of Homer versus Marcus Aurelius. There might be other reasons to settle that question. Neither does it settle the question of Latin versus Greek, although, of course, I've settled that question. I know we should anyway. It is ironic to me, by the way, this is parenthetical. If Greek were written using Latin characters, I bet more classical Christian schools had studied Greek.
Yeah.
Truth is, it's just more baffling when you first pick up a page of text.
Right, because the letters look wrong, and they don't make the sounds they're supposed to make.
So you've got an activation barrier at the start. Okay, but glad we're in agreement about that. Like what I did there. Anyway, but so what we're wanting to say is, I'm not asking anybody to change their model if they think, this just brings too much baggage with it that I don't find helpful or comfortable. What I do want to say is Christian anthropology and Christian respect for our heritage.
Yeah.
The same thing that makes us conservative politically ought to make us conservative educationally and ideologically.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
well, and a side point on that, I would not want to just immediately say, like, okay, if whatever you're doing, if you're educating your family Christianly according to Christian principles, Christian anthropology, those kinds of things, just because, like you're saying, just because it doesn't have the label classical, that's not an immediate reason to be like, everything that's not classical is bad. That's just not true. And it's not to say, like, for whatever reason, the circumstances don't even matter. Let's say that it would be rather unfeasible for whatever reason for someone to do classical education. They can't homeschool for whatever reason, or if they can, they are prevented from getting the kind of training they would need to do this, or there's no classical Christian school around them, or whatever the circumstance might be. Okay, great. Still raise your child Christianly.
Yes.
And so that's the first part. If you can do that, you're a whole lot better than probably 99% of the rest of the stuff.
Right.
I mean, that's raising your child Christianly, thinking Christianly about the world. That's the most fundamental piece.
Yes.
I might make the case that doing it classically, according to certain principles, is even better, but that's not to say that all the other things are therefore bad.
Right. So now that's really helpful because it means we can segue to the question of different educational settings. Now, I've got a note here. I want to come back to this question of vocation, but I think that will actually work quite well later in our conversation. But let's just park that briefly. So different educational settings. Let me try and sketch what I think the landscape looks like here. So on the surface, we've got a bunch of options. So there are government schools everywhere, many of which used to be Christian in some parts of the world. In the UK, they used to be proper Christian government schools. Now, you've got a question then still about the proper role of government in education, but you could at least find a Christian headmistress, Christian teachers in a government school. Anyway, so there's that. Most are not like that nowadays. And then you've got a whole portfolio of options open to conscientious Christian parents their heads are spinning now because they're trying to figure out what educational paradigm, classical, something else, and now they've got to figure out whether we do it at home or at home with other people, co-op, or at home with a kind of university model school kind of part-time thing, or do we do it in a school setting? We find a classical school or a Christian school or whatever we do. And so as we try to think through those parameters, you already hinted that there may be all kinds of reasons why people are constrained. Just to clear the decks, let's talk about a couple of constraints briefly that needn't detain us much longer, and then we'll talk about some of the family constraints, which I think we should talk about. So sometimes you find a situation where, let's say, a Christian mum, a mum becomes a Christian and a husband is not a believer. He's not willing to pull their kids out of the school that he's paying a lot of money for. It's a private, non-Christian school, or they're just going to a government school somewhere. He's not willing. Clearly, that mum is not going to be able to give the same kind of Christian education to her children because her husband is not a believer.
Yeah.
Ditto, back in England, we had situations at the church I pastored there where you'd have a single mum who made some sinful, ungodly choices, or had just been abandoned by her husband or a former husband. Now is raising a child on her own. Child's 15 or 16 years old, going to a local government school. In reality, it's just not possible for her to give her child the education she'd like to give him. And those are depictions of real situations that I have been or am in contact with. So there are those exceptions, okay? However, exceptions make bad pastoral theology.
Yes.
And sometimes they function as kind of legitimating excuses for people who don't want to change or who are just daunted by the cost of discipleship. And
Yeah.
Jesus said, the cost of discipleship is quite great. There are some hard choices to be made. Here's one. If you are in a position where you can't just ship your kid off to a government school and have the job done wonderfully, which we can't, we're required to do the best we can to raise our kids. Ephesians 6.
Yeah.
And education is a part of Christian nurture, part of raising our kids. So, homeschool, co-op, small school, big school. There are going to be pros and cons for different families in different settings, but there are pros and cons that are built into those different institutional settings. So just leaving aside for a second the issue of, well, there's no Christian school near me, or there's no Christian school I can afford, what do you see as the distinctive pros and cons of a school, full-time school, a part-time school like the Oaks where you've been working, versus co-op homeschool?
Yeah.
Take your time to answer this one.
Yeah. I'm trying to think through too, like, do I even have any thoughts for, like, let's say that you get the single mom and there's not even a homeschool co-op or something right by her. I mean, and so she's like, well, legally I have to put my kids in school. I can't stay home. What do I do? And it's like, that is a rough spot to be in. And I'm not sure that I have an immediate response. Part of that is like the individual circumstance. So I can't get a general answer to that question.
Yeah, no, and I'm not asking you to. I mean,
Right,
it's
yeah.
more, if we I mean, in that situation, I can tell you back in England, we did the best we could to help her, to disciple her. We had a couple of families in that position, actually, and we did the best we could in a church context to kind of disciple those kids, and we did Bible studies with them and that kind of thing. But there are, the situations that we're talking about now is you've got a family, they got 4, 6, 2, and 1 on the way. 6, 4, 2, and 1 on the way. And they're like, well, okay, we've got, Dad's got a decent job. We could send our kids to a school like the Oaks, or we could send them to your school, or we could keep them at home, educate them there. Do you have any thoughts on the pros and cons of that, just in broad terms?
Yeah.
That wouldn't constrain any individual family, but might be factors for individuals to consider.
Yeah. So you brought this up already, Ephesians 6.
Yeah.
I mean, who's responsible for raising those kids and educating those kids? Mm-hmm. It's first, and I mean, the scriptures lay out for us fathers, but then parents broadly.
Yes.
So I think the first thing that any family really needs to think about is like, okay, it's, I'm thinking of my son. It's my job to educate my son. It's my responsibility, and the Lord holds me accountable for his education.
Yeah.
So whether I homeschool him or put him in a school or whatever I do, his education is my responsibility.
Yeah.
So thinking about homeschooling, I've not done it. My son stays at home right now. He's almost 2, and so we're a couple days a week we'll drop him off at like a little play daycare kind of thing. But other than that, he's at home, and we're doing that kind of thing with him. And so in one sense, I guess you could call that, but not really. So beyond that, though, homeschooling is incredibly difficult, especially if you've got the 6, 4, 2 thing. Multiple kids. It's really, really hard. And so that's not to say that it's bad in any way. That's just to point out to families like, okay, in this homeschooling system, you are most directly able to fulfill that responsibility of educating your children. You have a direct access. I am literally doing it. And so that's the major upside to that. It's like, okay, I'm responsible. I'm going to do it. It's,
It's hands-on.
Yeah, it's hands-on. And it's one of those like, well, I know that if I'm doing it, I'm responsible. I'm going to work really hard to make sure that I'm doing this well. I don't well, not to say that there aren't any. I'm not aware. I know several students who were homeschooled to various degrees. I'm not aware of any of them that are. I can think of one family who has had some problems after they homeschooled their kids. The vast majority of them I can think of, kids are doing really well because the parents were there, they were involved, they cared, and some of them were classical, some of them were not. Either way, those homeschoolers are often very bright, very caring. They love the Lord. They're well adjusted and have good manners because they had parents who were there, who were connected. And often that meant the downside, if you want to call this a downside, is they don't have the family vacations in the same way. They don't have the nice car. Their house is usually much smaller. They're missing a lot of those material goods. And in some ways, that does mean that their children missed out on certain kinds of experiences, even ones that would have been good. There is the sort of trope of like homeschooling can mean that your kids are bubble contained.
Yes.
And so they don't get exposed either socially to other people or ideologically. So that is one thing that I've noticed with some homeschooling students is they think sort of in the like me and my Bible fundamentalist kind of ways of like there is exactly one correct way of thinking. Anyone who disagrees with me in any way is wrong. And that's that because they haven't been exposed to other ideas. This is not to say that it's true for everybody who homeschools. A lot of homeschoolers get that robust big thing. But that is to say that is a potential downside is if parents aren't being conscious of this, kids could grow up just knowing here's what mom and dad think and there's nothing else.
Right.
So that's a potential danger.
Right. And that danger increases precisely in proportion to the degree of self-conscious theological or ideological content in the education.
Yeah.
Right? So Christian educators don't tend to have quarrels over math.
Yeah.
But they sometimes have quarrels over theology and history and was this person a good person or a bad person? How are we supposed to articulate our views of two sides in the war between the states, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you can imagine all kinds of squabbles there.
Well, yeah, so perfect example, Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
So he gave us divine simplicity and more or less transubstantiation.
Right.
Good
Thanks,
guy
Thomas.
or bad guy.
Yeah. Yeah. So part of me thinks then that this is another angle on a biblical question of the diversity of gifts. So you could make a case for a home element in education on the basis of hands-on taking responsibility. God holds me accountable for this, I should do it. But at the same time, you recognize, look, I can't do everything, and I can still remain responsible for things that I conscientiously delegate to competent authorities.
Yeah.
You know, if I ask a competent tree surgeon to come and prune my tree at the front of my house, I'm responsible for finding a guy who's got decent reviews, right?
Yeah.
And then I delegate that responsibility to him, and he's contractually obligated to fulfill it in certain ways. And in effect, we could do that within a Christian community where, you know, and my wife found this when we were starting out on a homeschool journey. We were at seminary at that time, and so there are lots of other families around thinking through, you know, what to do with our kids. And it turns out my wife is an engineer, and so math and physics and chemistry are easy for her. She's a chemical engineer by training. Whereas history and English literature were easy for some of the other mums. And so just by getting together 1 or 2 mornings a week, they could play to their strengths and the kids benefited. Now, kids didn't benefit 100%, right? Because some of the kids, I guess our kids picked up our mathematical genes, and we went slower because we're in a diverse class setting in those math settings, sometimes because we're trying to help the other students to catch up on the collies. Similarly, I don't know what it was like for the intuitive historian to have to slow down to the pace of less intuitively historically minded kids, maybe like ours, I don't know. So there is a kind of give and take there. And one of the strengths of a homeschooling environment is you can push your kid as fast as you want to push them.
Yeah.
And there's no sense of I need to compromise, either at pace or curriculum content or anything. I can just do what I want with my kid. And so you could be in a position where your kid excels fast. Flip side, of course, is you could be in a position where your kid goes very slowly, and you either don't realize that they're going slowly, because, hey, you're homeschooling them and they're doing fine, but they've got no standard to compare you to.
Yeah.
Or you do kind of realize, but there's that awkward and potentially destructive interplay between I don't really know what the standard is that they ought to be at this age, or I do know but I don't care because we're not trying to do a secular education. We're not going to go by that standard. And one of my thoughts about homeschooling, how best to put it, every weakness is a distorted strength. Every sin is righteousness twisted.
Right.
So the same setting that provides the opportunity to encourage your kid to excel because you're not held back by anybody else also provides the mirror image negative opportunity to let your kid be slack because, hey, you're not pushed by anybody else.
Yeah.
You get into a co-op or you get into a school, my instinct, and I've taught in a Christian school here at the Oaks with you, is that what ought to happen is the kids who are moving fast benefit from having other kids around them. The kids who are moving slower benefit from a kick in the seat of the pants to move them on a little bit.
Yeah.
Is that something you've seen in practice?
Yeah. So an analogy that might be helpful is in increasing levels of bluntness, the homeschooling is kind of like a surgeon's knife.
Mm-hmm.
Be very specific. And the large school on the upper end of the spectrum is a sledgehammer.
Mm-hmm.
Not very specific, but it does what it does really well. It clears broad swaths in what it does. So just the analogy obviously only goes so far, but if you think about the homeschool, okay, it's very, very precise. You can do exactly what you want, what have you. You can't tear down a building with a surgeon's knife. You could, but it'd be very difficult. So there may, like you're saying, there may be room to move up to this co-op or university-style school kind of thing where they meet, a couple days a week, because we've definitely seen that here at the Oaks. I've seen it in multiple environments. When there are other students around, suddenly the really top ones begin to push each other, and they get better. So I can think of two students here who I require students to turn in 3 observations from their reading. And these two students, once they realized that the other one was pushing a little bit, now they turn in like a multi-page document.
Right.
Of like all these thoughts from their reading, and it's all really deep stuff. And I have to constantly tell them, like, hey, just so you know, like you're going way above and beyond.
But they're pushing each other.
And they like it.
Yeah.
And for the most part, students who are a little bit slower now have an environment that kind of helps pull them a little bit. And so it's kind of like, imagine you've got a rope wrapped around your waist and you're kind of laying in the mud. Somebody pulls you up. So you've got kind of 2 options. If you use that rope pulling you to start running, you can go from being stuck in the mud to moving. You're going to be behind everybody else, but you're still going to be moving. There is the flip side of the student who's just stuck in the mud and is going to just fall back down into the mud. Okay, well, that's a different issue. School can't fix that. No school can fix a student who just absolutely refuses.
Right,
That's more of a parental issue.
Yeah.
And a discipline issue and those kinds of things. And it's just a heart sin issue. I mean, forget the parents for a minute. That's
just ungodliness.
Yeah, it's just
we'll come to that in a second because I think that's a pastoral issue. But
yeah. So the benefit to if you want to call it a small school, multi-day school, co-op environment, collaborative model. There's all different kinds of ways of doing that. You get them at home,
Mm-hmm.
and you're directly talking to your student multiple days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And with especially with younger students, you're still doing some of the teaching, and so there's this back and forth between sort of a trained classroom teacher who knows this thing pretty well, and you, as the parent, getting to sort of work on this together. So a point you made, this wasn't really the question you asked, but a point you made earlier is, you got math and science training and things like that. And some parents are going to be better at this thing, are going to be better at that thing. And when students are real young and they're learning absolute basics, doing grammar stage sort of stuff, most parents are going to be equipped.
They can do that
to teach it or to learn how to teach it.
Yeah, you can learn how to teach how to do basic math.
Yeah,
even if you can't really remember long division, right?
Right. Yeah, but you can do basic, arithmetic and those kinds of things. But when students do start to get older, it's like, okay, well, now we're getting into specialized ways of thinking, and so the parent can do that, but they're undoubtedly going to have to try to push against their strengths in learning things that God has not directly gifted them to do.
Yeah.
And that's not wrong, but it's going to be very hard. So if you're someone who just loves literature and you suffered through calculus, it's like, well, okay, but if you want to teach your kid calculus, now you got to learn how to do it. Or doing sort of this hybrid model thing, when they start to get older, the advantage is like, okay, hey, we have somebody who's really good at math, and they're going to impart their gifts, like you said.
They can teach calculus.
Yeah, they can teach the calculus, and this other person can teach this, and you still get to be with them at home and working through them and some of these things. I think the most important part is when it comes to some of the coursework. And this is if a good collaborative style school will do this. When it gets to the pieces of coursework, it's like, hey, we've got specialized teachers who have trained in this. They know it. They're going to teach them. And we're going to discuss ideas.
Yes, yes.
And so students, your job is to go home and tell your parents about the ideas that we're discussing. And so they can pour into you, especially there. And rather than the sort of public school model, which is in many ways, this is truth, believe these things, maybe don't tell your parents.
Yeah, and you, please don't tell your parents because they might discover what we're doing over here and we don't want that.
Versus we very much have a like, hey, let's debate through some of these ideas and then go home and talk to mom and dad. Go home and talk to your pastor and go, what do you think?
Right. It's interesting you raise it in that way because I guess one thought about standards comes back to me. So it's not just, there are a couple of issues that overlap. One is, in general terms, an educational setting that is cut off from institutional settings, whether a Christian school or any other kind of school. It's harder to know where you should be, quote unquote, or ditch should. What's a reasonable expectation? And my memory of when we started doing this with our kids was we were conscious that we didn't want to have secular government schools as our model. But the reason we didn't want to do that was because we wanted to do better, not worse.
Yeah.
And so we did make a kind of chart or get some picture of what the national curriculum in England is what it's called, what the national curriculum required and expected at different stages. And our goal was not to aim for that. Our goal was to make sure we exceeded that.
Yeah.
Because you ought to be able to, right?
Yeah.
If you're doing, you at least insofar as you've got the variation among different children and so on, but you ought, minimally, you ought to be able to do better than an educational system where students spend 50% of their time waiting for something to happen, which is what one survey showed in England. So there's that issue of standards broadly. But then in a more focused way, one of my fears, concerns, I'll put it better, one of my concerns for home educators is that as their kids grow older, their education narrows to only those things in which parents feel they have expertise. And that can put a cap on children's aspirations and accomplishments at precisely the point where we want them to be exceeding us as parents.
Yeah.
So I do not want my kids' history knowledge to be limited by what I remember from high school. And I think that's less of a temptation for us. I'll be honest. I think in our circles, we have huge resources in literature and the arts and humanities. We have fewer in the STEM subjects. And I think it's much more common for parents to feel that they're running out of physics, chemistry, and math steam at about the age of 10 or 11. And there's so much else that they could do. They just do those other things. And to my mind, that's a failure, insofar as it's a failure to utilize the diversity of gifts in the body. It's a failure to push ourselves and our children into new territory. It's a failure to fully appreciate all the richness of the world God's placed us in. It's a failure to have proper ambition for our children. And often it's a failure that takes place under pressure. It's exhausting being a parent, and so on and so forth. And an educational setting that takes you out of just yourself and your home and your comfort zone is like the smoke alarm going off in the room. It's like, hello, your kid's now doing math that you can't help them with.
Yes.
Correct. Congratulations, right? That's really good. And that's the point at which the parental encouragement of the children becomes so important.
Yeah.
It's like, Dad can't help you with this, neither can Mum. Sorry, son, you're on your own. But you're not on your own. You've got your teachers at school. You've got us here. We're here to help you. Let's figure out how much time you need to do this. Let's create an environment where you can study in a really disciplined way and go way beyond us in what you're accomplishing.
Yeah. And this is where I think the biblical discussion of different gifts, different parts of the body. As parents, we're equipped to do the things that we need to do to raise our children, but that doesn't mean that we have to do everything.
Right. We might not be the best people to do everything.
Yeah. So God has given us what he needs us to do. But that doesn't mean, that we might not be the best person to do every single thing that will be beneficial to our children. So that's where the sort of small school collaborative style thing can be extremely beneficial, because it's like, look, other people are good at this. And they're Christians, they're members of the body. Let them use their gifts, just like you can use your gifts. And that doesn't mitigate the parental responsibility.
It actually gives the parents something to aim at. Gives them a target. Here's the homework for the week. Got to do this. Right. Okay. We've got to do this. Let's do it.
And so maybe a helpful way of maybe thinking about this is, I am not aware of a whole lot of, probably none. I should say none. I'm aware of no homeschooling families that would be like, look, I'm going to home educate you purely based off what's in my brain. We're not going to use any books.
Perish the thought.
We're not going to do anything. I'm just going to teach you what's in my head. It's like, well, no, you're going to use a book.
Right,
well, that book's a tool.
It's a resource.
It's a resource. So is the teacher.
Yeah.
So the teacher is I hate to talk about humans in this way, but I think the point will get across. It's a human resource. So the teacher who knows something in a particular field is just the same as using a book.
Because a book is a person speaking. Right. So here's a thought that is in the background, and let's bring it to the foreground. We have been talking as though you can have a child who has been educated at home for a while, maybe for the first few years or part of the time, all the way through teenage years, and now they're in an educational setting, whether co-op, school, maybe it's still at home. We've been talking as though that child could be given a piece of work to do and instructed to spend the next hour and 10 minutes working on this essay or this sequence of math problems or this chemistry experiment write-up. And that child would say, yes, Mum, absolutely. I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And they would go and sit at their nice, neat, tidy desk with no distractions and obediently and cheerfully undertake the tasks. What? And you seem like you find this amusing. How old's your oldest child?
Not quite two.
Not quite two. Well, welcome to fatherhood. Okay, so
Yeah, and I'm laughing just thinking about the neat, tidy desk because I'm like,
yeah,
my desk
where would they
is
have learned that
fucking
from?
tidy.
Yeah. So here's the issue, and I'll put it in the terms in which we heard it. When our oldest is now 21 in October. When we started out on our homeschool journey, so to speak, sort of early 2000s, we went to a little half-day conference at a church somewhere in North London, if I recall rightly. I might be getting the details wrong, but I distinctly remember somebody either there or somewhere else saying, if you haven't got kids who are well-disciplined, forget homeschooling. If you haven't got kids who, when you say to them, please come over here, please go and grab your math textbook, please go and tidy your room, please get up out of bed, it's time for work. If you haven't got kids who you can leave them alone for an hour and they'll do what you tell them to do, from the earliest age, forget about any kind of home education. And over the years, I've come to realize that, well, that speaker was talking about home education. I don't want to say, yeah, if you haven't got kids who are well-disciplined, forget about any kind of education. Because as a teacher, and I've been a teacher, albeit in one morning a week, not as much as you, I know very well the experience of giving children an assignment, which I'll email sometimes to their parents as well. If I have their parents' email address, I'll always try and email parents the assignments as well. And goodness gracious me, the student shows up the next week and the assignment isn't done. And you say, and you realise that as you dig a bit more deeply into some of those family relationships, and I take off my teacher hat and put on my pastoral collar, you realise, yeah, really, really, what's going on here is that mum and dad have lost control of the home, and the kids do not cheerfully, promptly, first time obey their parents' instructions. And therefore, there is no model of education which is going to work for them until that changes. Yeah. Do you have any reflections on that? I mean, I'm not really asking you as a parent. You've got a little one. Yeah. Do you have any reflections on that from the point of view of the teacher? Because you must have had interactions with students and parents who are across this sort of spectrum of how things are going at home.
Yeah. My first thought from my very little experience as a parent, like, one, more or less, children don't come well-disciplined. You have to well-discipline them.
Yeah, Psalm 51 is still true.
Yes. So I can think about my son, who's a rather amicable, obedient child.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not always. And
yes.
So that requires me as dad to step in. So just, I guess, maybe slight encouragement, thought for everybody. Mm-hmm. You have to do the disciplining.
Yeah.
But yeah, as a teacher, I mean, I've worked in a couple of environments, and certainly there are students who I'm like, oh, your parents don't discipline you. I can just tell by your lack of restraint. Mm-hmm. So I can think of one class setting that I was in, and I had a student who would just all the time, thought came into their head, came out of their mouth. And there was no reporting them to the dean that changed that. Because as far as their parents were concerned, that wasn't a big deal. And so I could discipline them in the classroom, but I'm not their parent. And so it's just the sort of the teacher can only do so much. I mean, there is a certain space for a teacher to kind of manage the classroom and corral the students and what have you. But, if you're getting them for 45, 50 minutes at a time, mm-hmm. you're not really disciplining their heart. You're just sort of helping correct their behavior. Yes. So if you've got a 15-year-old who is undisciplined, there's nothing I can do as a teacher to fix that. I can maybe in a very rare circumstance, like maybe this is a 15-year-old without a dad, and I take a particular interest in the student, and I'm like, hey, let's talk, and we have this routine sort of coaching going on, that could eventually develop into something because you're sort of
you become a kind of mentor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Teacher, quab, mentor, parent, whatever. But if I'm just doing sort of regular teaching functions, me snapping my fingers and hey, that kind of thing, or quit talking, whatever it is.
You're just course correction. You're not actually changing.
I'm just course correcting, and so it doesn't matter what environment they're in.
Yeah. Well, I want to add to that. If there's a young person in that kind of situation, it's not just that there's nothing the teacher can do. There's nothing a pastor can do either. So, in fact, there's nothing anybody can do, and I mean that quite sincerely. And if we now approach this issue of shepherding a child's heart, let's say, to quote somebody, or disciplining children, we approach it not from the direction of what's necessary in order for education to function, but how does Scripture speak about this? Yeah. This is about repentance. It's basically about living a life of faithfulness that's in keeping with Christian faith and faithfulness. And you cannot repent for somebody. You cannot do anything for somebody who does not want to repent, besides pray for the change of heart and the change of desires. And I guess what I want to say to parents and young people is your education, the education of the child, is extremely demanding for the children and for the parents. And the demand doesn't begin with curriculum choices and educational paradigm and execution. It begins with disciplining the child. And by disciplining, I don't mean just thrashing them harder. Okay, I don't mean that at all, in fact. What I mean is so nurturing and discipling, and if necessary at times, especially when they're young, chastising them, that they come to love and walk in the way of righteousness that you're showing them.
Yeah.
So if you're a 15-year-old, if you've got a 15-year-old that won't do what mum and dad say and won't turn their work in for their teacher, you're already dealing with a problem that should have been dealt with 14 and a half years earlier.
Yeah.
So the way to get the outcome of hardworking, conscientious, faithful teenager is to think, well, what would I want them to have been like one day previously? And what about one day before that? And one day before that. And what you notice, if you play the clock backwards, it becomes easier. It's much easier to discipline a 2-year-old than a 15-year-old.
Yeah. Yes.
And so the challenge for parents is to recognize that, in effect, they're in a fight. Yeah. They're in a fight against sin, the world, and the devil, who wants to take control of their child's heart, and their child's heart belongs to Jesus Christ. But that doesn't mean that the child will magically walk in the way of Christ. Yeah. They need to be shown the way. They need to be chastised when they step off the road. They need to be encouraged when they're walking along the road. And that needs to be done consistently, vigorously, clear-headedly, prayerfully. And it needs to start early. There is never an easier time to discipline your child just around the corner. It's just behind you around the previous corner. So start now, wherever you are.
Yeah.
And what that means is, this is now a whole bunch of other things to talk about. It means an end to all these ridiculous fads about gentle parenting and hands-off parenting and asking permission to change your 6-month-old's diaper and all the ludicrous stuff.
Yes.
It means seeking to get to a point where your child is most happy in cheerfully obeying their parents' gracious and encouraging instructions. Mm-hmm. So it's like, hey Jenny, it's time to do the dishes after breakfast. Big smile on her face. Yes, mum. Okay. Hey Johnny, it's time to do your maths homework. Great. Yes, mum. And that turns into the 10-year-old or the 12-year-old that just wants to do the math homework, and the 14-year-old, you come home and she's already done the dishes. Yeah. Because the children have learned to embrace that kind of faithfulness. Yeah. And there's nothing a school can do that will post hoc fix that. You are
Yeah.
you can work together with parents, and it becomes something which churches and pastors and discipleship leaders, if you have such things in your church, need to be involved.
Yeah.
When you get to the stage, if you get to the stage, that some more serious course correction needs to be done.
Yeah.
But let me summarize it like this. The foremost prerequisite for a child to have a fruitful education is that whenever mum or dad say, hey, come on, time to do X, the child cheerfully and immediately just goes ahead and does it.
Yeah.
If that's not in place, that needs to be got in place.
Yeah.
And it can be got in place, it can be recovered, but it is much, much easier to start younger.
Yes. Yeah. And I think this is where in my experience, a lot of families, Christian or not, are expecting, I say a lot, maybe many, I'm not sure.
Some
are expecting the school to take care of these things. In fact, I've gotten this email, like, you're the school, it's your job to fix X, Y, or Z. And as a young teacher, I didn't respond this way. I would now. Like, no, it's not my job. My job is to provide some formation and information to your student, but not to form their heart. And I think I'd go on to say this: if I had to pick between two extremes, between a child who has been well formed in the home, is well disciplined, is cheerfully responding to mom and dad, is being obedient, but doesn't ever learn math, science, history, whatever. Assume that you take away all the school stuff and just do the disciplining, versus the student who goes and gets the absolute best package of information. The first one's going to do better in the world every time.
Right. Yeah.
They would be, stupid according to informational, like they couldn't do math, they wouldn't know anything about history, all those things. They would still function better in the world.
And the truth is that by God's grace, we don't need to choose.
Right.
And in fact, we won't be, because a child who is that cheerful, godly, faithful, well-disciplined young person is going to have embraced their education to their maximum capacity. Yeah. It's not to say that we're all going to turn out like Schrodinger or Einstein, but different children are going to have different temperaments, different preferences, different abilities, just raw intellectual firepower. But you want all the kids to max out what they're capable of, and the thing that's holding them back is their own capacity for self-government and discipline, and that's the responsibility of parents to inculcate. Yeah. Now, it's interesting, I want to circle back to the final point that we mentioned earlier on, because this now does touch on vocation in the sense that it's talking about their future in the world. Maybe if I characterize it like this, tell me your reaction to this. Historically, it's certainly the case that the American education system was designed in, I think, the mid to late 19th century to produce, and early 20th century, to produce effective factory workers, basically drones for industrial production. Yep. And even the universities, which previously had existed for the formation of character and the study of the great questions of life. Harvard was a Christian institution, and so was Oxford in England. They became infected with the same mindset. They were basically about producing output for the workforce. Now, the nature of work has changed, information revolution and so on, and everything else that's happened since the Industrial Revolution. But the goal has been still to produce workers for the economy, good tax-paying citizens.
Yes.
Right? Now, the Christian educational revolution that we're blessed by and enjoying the benefits of and participating in has started to say, whoa, hold on a second. Education isn't just about your vocation, how you earn money in the long term. It's about the formation of character. Yeah. And I want to say, yay and amen. We gave our kids the closest thing we could give them to a classical Christian education for that reason. But, hold on a second. Are we in danger of tacitly conceding the underlying point that being a worker in the economy is somehow only something that a socialism-embracing factory drone would want to do. Isn't being a worker in the economy a glorious dignity for those called to it?
Yeah.
Which is going to be most people, at least at some point in their lives. Most people work. Most people, even who end up being mothers for large proportions of their adult life, nonetheless will work in some calling or other besides being an educator and a mother, which itself is an intellectually demanding domain. So in other words, can we articulate a vision for education that includes all the things that you've said and we've talked about, but also preserves the place of a calling in whatever profession it is, white collar, blue collar, whatever it is, as a dignified and worthwhile goal of your education. So it's good to do STEM. It's good to do history. It's good to do whatever it is you're doing, because both character formation and also vocational training.
Yeah.
Are you happy with that, or do you want to? Does the classical Christian bit of you flinch?
Yeah. So I think that there's always a temptation in our modern setting to want to always push towards vocational. So that's not what you were saying, but I think sort of average mindset, it's very easy to just go, okay, classical education for the sake of vocation. It's like, well, back up. We don't need to do that. But at the same time, we don't want to ignore the fact that people need to buy food.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there is a sense in which we do need to prepare young people to go be workers. Not in the factory drone setting, but in the fact of they need to buy food setting. Like, you have to work.
Well, isn't it also, it's cultural mandate, it's Great Commission. We want to work because work is what image bearers of God do.
Yeah.
It's not just, I need to buy bread from Walmart. I want to creatively and industriously engage with the created order where God's put me.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, with the exception of very few, it'd be hard to just stay at home and do nothing all day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you want to do, I mean, this is why young men get so pulled into something like video games, because it feels like you're accomplishing
something. It feels like activity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, shameless plug for Christ College.
Hey, why not?
Yeah, why not? We're already here. The first 3 years of that curriculum are rigorous intellectual and character formation.
Mm.
So, I mean, reading all the stuff, very, very demanding curriculum. The last year is what we're calling entrepreneurial education.
Interesting.
And not just in the sense of like going and starting your own business. But how do I then take all of this stuff and go do something with it?
Mm-hmm.
And so some of that is business oriented or what have you. But the whole thought is, I've gotten all of this training, especially if I went through a K through 12 classical school and then I got, several more years of college level training. How do I go do something with that?
Yes.
How do I just, practically speaking, take it out into the world? Because you're going to have to do that.
Yeah. And it's not just, I mean, it's restating the point I made earlier. It's not you have to do it. It's what a glorious dignity to be able to do it. You want people to have the character such that they view whatever vocation they're in, IT or plumbing or construction or accountancy, they view that as cultivating the world where God's placed them.
Yeah. And I mean, even if it's, I don't want to say just, but thinking of jobs, even if you're, air quotes, just going to be a stay-at-home parent, how do you do that? How do you take all the things that you've learned and go do that thing?
Right. Which turns out to have some practically very demanding aspects that you need to learn how to do.
Yeah, which is why I can't think of a better word to say than just, but you know what I mean.
I do.
Yeah.
It's something that Nicole used to encounter frequently. She stopped working for the oil company she was working for when Ben was born, and people say, "Are you going to go back to work, or are you just a mum?" And at which point I would hit the roof normally if I heard. But,
it's like I can't think of a better word because it's demanding, incredibly. It's a job, just not in the standard workforce. But that's getting off the point. So vocational training, I think, to think of education as something for the purposes of getting a job is somewhat misguided. To think of education in terms of I'm going to become the right kind of person.
Right.
I'm going to become the kind of person who can fulfill the creation mandate in the way that God has made me to do it.
And in that particular job.
Right. And so there is room to say, like, a lot of my education is forming me into the right person. There is some room to say, okay, and now how do we train you to do this particular thing? That's also good.
Absolutely.
The danger, I think, like we were talking about, is that there's always going to be this pull towards just the vocational.
Right. Which short circuits the character and everything else.
Yeah. But if we can say, hey, the character is first, the eternal questions are first, and the person who answers these questions well will be a much better kind of person answering these vocational questions.
Right.
If we can get that order correct, I think there's nothing wrong with vocational training, as long as we know that it's a secondary effect, not the primary cause, so to speak.
So, maybe we could frame it as this is the application of Christian character to a narrow and specific discipline.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah. Tyler Bauer, it has been a pleasure talking with you, as it always is. I'm grateful to you for giving us so much of your time for this first All Saints podcast with somebody else in our new studio. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm hopeful that once you're settled into your new vocation over in Florida, we'll either be able to get you back on Zoom call or get you over here in person, and we can do this again and talk about some of these other things. But thank you very much to all of you for being making it this far, getting to the end. This will do for now. The Lord bless you, and bye for now.